So, with that said, last week we talked about the archetypes and these strange sort of groupings of images and feeling tone energies that all sort of swirl around some sort of core experience, kind of a primal experience like giving birth, you know, or the sun moving through the sky, mothers and fathers, things like that. We talked specifically about the mother-child complex or archetype. We looked at a variety of examples of that throughout history, going way back before Christianity into Hellenistic and Egyptian cultures. And then moving forward and trying to see some contemporary examples of where that archetype might be being expressed in art. I think we used 2001: A Space Odyssey. By the way, Odysseus is such an important character in the ancient world, and I believe he's also a forgotten, unacknowledged important character in the formation of the gospel. If you've gone to seminary, or if you've done formal studies, or if you've just poked around in biblical studies, I'll bet 90% chance that you haven't heard anything about Odysseus in relationship to the gospel, because it's just not done. We usually look at biblical prototypes of the Christian story. But Odysseus, it turns out, is an incredible prototype for the gospel. And I won't have time to really explore that at length with you because it's just too much information. But there was a thing in the ancient world, in the Greek world, called mimesis, or mimesis, if you want to say it another way, which is imitation, means imitation. And that's how they did their education. They imitated and read Homer. Homer was the fundamental tool for learning how to speak Greek. Everybody learned Homer. And they had it memorized, and they used it for pedagogy, for teaching purposes. And so Odysseus is the archetypal hero. And his journeys lay out beautifully. It's the great story of the Western culture and civilization, the Odyssey. It's amazing the amount of parallels and similarities between Homer's Odyssey and Mark's Gospel. And as I say, I develop it with you, but if you're interested, I can give you a reference. It's a book by a man named Dennis MacDonald, who teaches down at Claremont. He's written a book called The Gospel of Mark and the Homeric Epics, I believe is the title. It's one of those game-changing books. So if you're interested in that sort of thing, there you go. So the hero's journey was the second archetypal complex we talked about. The third one we didn't talk about is number. Archetypes can be encoded in numbers, and we know about sacred numbers. You know, 1 is a sacred number. 2, 3 and 4. 3 plus 4 is 7. 3 times 4 is 12. 3s and 4s and 7s and 12s all wind up in sacred texts as sort of coded archetypal figures, let's say. And we're going to be looking at that. That's going to be very important for us, especially the number 4. Matter of fact, of course, Jung had his 4, what he calls a quaternity. Quaternity is an organization of 4 in a single sort of symbol. Think of a pie with 4 quarters in it. That would be a quaternity. Solar myths were huge. Matter of fact, and again, something I don't have time to go into here, there were 3 basic kinds of myths in the Greek or pagan world. They were solar and stellar or astral myths on the one hand. They were vegetative, or around the seasons and the growing and the food and all of that. And then there were fertility myths. Those were the 3 big categories of how myths were shaped and formed. What we're going to focus on mostly is the solar myth, the myth of the sun. Of course, the sun's not a myth, but it has become mythologized, and the hero's journey is wrapped up in the movement of the sun across the sky through the zodiac. And this is, again, like Homer's Odyssey, just fundamental sort of knowledge almost you could say the science of its day. What we think of as astrology in contemporary terms, and I'm really not talking about that. I'm talking about an ancient form of understanding as above, so below. So the story of the heroes is written in the story of the stars. And there's a huge connection there between what's going on up there and what's going on down here. Jung had his own quaternity, 4 functions, sensing, which tells you that something is there at its most primordial level. We sense it's in my field of view, and what is it? Thinking tells us what it is. It derives the categories that explain a thing in terms of content. Feeling tells us what its value is. What is its value to me? How do I relate to it? Is it safe? How does it come into my personal world? And intuition connects it with larger meaning. Where did it come from? Where is it going? What does it mean? That at its most simple level are the 4 perceptual and judging functions according to Jung. And he organized those into pairs of, 2 pairs of opposing functions, thinking and feeling, and sensing and intuition. And so those are all pulling at each other, and those are sort of the archetypal complexes, if you will, of the human person and perception. Let me put this on pause and tell a little personal story. My wife and I perform. She sings, I play guitar. We do that from time to time. We played last night, and it was one of those nights, you know. I got to the place, and I got set up, and clicked on my guitar tuner, and no tuner. Okay, not a problem, you know. I went to my backup, which is on my iPhone. I have a tuner app on my iPhone. It's very cool. You know, you hit it, and up comes a guitar tuner. Well, it didn't load. So that's, you know, main one down, backup down, and it was sort of an indication that this was the kind of night it was going to be. And lo and behold, my guitar didn't actually work last night. I plugged it in, it was like nothing. So it was just kind of one of those nights, and it got to the point where it started to impact on my performance, where, you know, you get nervous, you get spooked a little bit, and you're just not into it. And I was worried about it, and I did not perform well. Of course, that's me saying that, right? And then, you know, people come up afterwards, oh, thank you so much, we enjoyed it, it was great, you know, all this sort of thing, and I'm thinking, did they hear what I was hearing? And of course they didn't, because every little mistake that happened or every little distraction that happened to me, they weren't paying attention to. They were just getting the big picture and enjoying the music, as you know, is normally the case. And I thought to myself this morning, isn't that exactly the way it is, that we take the little things, we blow them up, we dramatize them, we exaggerate them, and we globalize, right? Because why? Because that's just what people do. That's what we are. We are dramatic by nature. And I think myth can be understood in some ways as dramatization of even those simple and basic and essential things. So let's ask a question as we move into today's material. What would these 4 functions look like if they were blown up, if they were exaggerated, if they were pumped full of religious intensity and drama and grandiosity, if I may use that word? What would they look like? And I think when we start to wrestle with that question, we get into the kind of work that I have been trying to do for the last several years in connecting the gospel and its drama and symbols with the Jungian system, if you want to call it that. What would intuition look like if it was a religious expression? I say it would look like vision. I say it would look like mystical vision. I say it would look like an experience of the transcendent, because intuition in many ways is the most sophisticated the most abstract function. It really seeks connection and meaning on a higher order of complexity. So in a religious context, it's going to be vision and mystical experience. So I asked myself, well, what is vision and mystical experience in the gospel? And oh boy, we get to do a lot of stuff with that, and I will in just a couple minutes. What would thinking look like if it were blown up and it was placed into a religious context? It would look like wisdom. And wisdom in the biblical tradition is an immense thing. I mean, you can write books on it, you can do lots of studies on it, going back into the Proverbs and Old Testament. And I have a good friend who's an Old Testament scholar who focuses on wisdom. But in the New Testament, it's an amazing component of what goes into the gospel story. The wisdom of Jesus, this sort of counter-order wisdom, and may I also say feminine wisdom. And I'd like to be able to unpack that. That'll probably be next week. We'll do intuition today, and if we get time, we'll do thinking. But I don't think we'll have time to do wisdom. Feeling. What would feeling look like? I say it would look like prophecy. Well, prophecy. How does prophecy tie in with feeling? Well, feeling is about value. Feeling is about relating, about what is important, about who is important, about how we relate to one another. So if I just said the word justice, I think we begin to make a connection there between feeling at its most basic, which is how does it relate to me, and this notion of, what's happening in a society, what is just, what is unjust, what is right, what is wrong, what is safe and what is not. And that is feeling. And then sensation. What would sensation look like in a religious dramatic context? It would look like sacrifice. It would look like that most fundamental thing to which we are called, which is to do, to act, to put your body on the line, to serve. And so those are the four sort of fundamental elements of this drama, and how they play out in the gospel is fascinating. My contention is that these four dimensions or elements actually frame and shape the movement of the gospel. And it, in a sense, as though the gospel drama is a stage. And each of these four, in its turn, sort of has its moment on the stage and presents itself to us. And they interact in a way that's dynamic and, in some ways antagonistic, and yet in some other ways very powerful and transformative. And so that's sort of how we're going to look at the story. And we'll see how much time we have to do the particulars. I'm just going to sort of back up for a second and explain to you how I kind of got into this and started making these connections between Jung and the gospel. Some of that's obvious, but I don't think you've ever heard probably anything like I just said. I'm going to guess you haven't, because I've never read it. So I'm going to tell you how I came onto it, and that was Marcus Borg. And I think you've studied Borg here. You've probably heard him lecture, that sort of thing. He wrote this book, Jesus and New Vision. And in that book, Borg uses social, cultural psychology or anthropology to analyze, if you will, Jesus, to kind of bring a historian's, social, cultural historian's view to this person of Jesus. And he does so in terms of four roles, you may recall. Haven't you read that book, by the way? Just one? Okay.
Oh my goodness.
More hands than that.
Yeah. Say the name of the book again, because people...
Jesus, A New Vision.
I have it if you need to rent it.
Well, the important thing, it was a pretty good seller for him. I think it put him on the map.
Yeah.
I mean, as a scholar and as a writer. And he uses four religious types. And now it's been a while. Healer, prophet, movement, a founder, and there was a sage, a wisdom teacher. And I was reading Borg and I'm thinking, wow, these are cultural sorts of roles. And he finds them in lots of different cultures, not just in the biblical culture. And so he interprets Jesus in light of these larger roles. Makes kind of sense, you know, it fills in some nice information. My question was, what if these are more than just social roles? What if they're archetypes? And if they're archetypes, how do we find them in the Bible? And that's what got me thinking in terms of 4. And anybody who's read Jung knows 4 is huge, because quaternity is itself archetypal. So that's what got me going. I wanted the 4 functions. I tried to find parallels between Borg, Jung, and the Gospel, and that was the little dance I did for a number of years, writing a dissertation, and now I'm in the book. So here we go. Jesus, this is, once again, I think I put this up in a former lecture, this is called the tetramorph. The tetramorph, tetra, 4 in Greek, morph, form. So the four form. And you can see the 4 here. Jesus is in the middle. This, by the way, here is, let me see if I can get the exact word for it. The vesica piscis, which means the vessel of the fish. And it's a sort of symbolic way of expressing transformation, boundary crossing, moving from one world to another. Oh, cool. Another fun thing to play with and think about. And this has a sort of venerable history in medieval Christianity. You'll see it all over the place. I think the next one I have is also, yeah, that's probably a little clearer. Here's Jesus with basically the 4, in this case, would be the 4 Gospels. Each of them was represented by one of the figures. It's also Jesus on the throne in the book of Revelation, where the 4 creatures are surrounding the throne. So this sense of 4-ness as being completion and fullness and wholeness is certainly biblical. The tetramorph, like the mother and child, goes way back. Goes all the way back to ancient Egypt, so it has a long history predating Christianity. But Jesus, sort of couched in this sense of 4-ness, is very, very much a Christian thing, very, very biblical, I would say. So let's look at, let's take one final look at a sort of general context now for looking at the story itself. And basically what I'm claiming is that there are parallel dramas occurring in Mark's Gospel. There's an outer drama and an inner drama. There's individual drama, there's collective drama. There's a divine and human drama. There is a sort of a descent and ascent in terms of the divine descending and the human ascending. And at moments, it's both. Both are happening. If you read the story psychologically from the point of view of the ego, you can see a developing person. You can see a person who's moving toward wholeness, what Jung called individuation. And I will sort of tackle that point of view here and there. But you can also see, if I can put it in colloquial terms, God reaching down and becoming human. And that's descent. And so you have 2 parallel lines of movement going on simultaneously in this story of the God-man, the divine human. And this, again, is not something that would have been unfamiliar to a Greek audience who was steeped in Homer's Odyssey and in also the solar myths of its day. Again, the self, that's Jung's term for this greater center of consciousness of what we are, sort of almost a mystical sounding term. The self is incarnating, taking on the individual identity of a situated person, me, Randy, you, John, Bill, incarnating, and the ego individuating, becoming whole, becoming full. And so those 2 lines of movement are going on simultaneously. The other thing we want to notice, and what we really want to focus our attention on, is this notion of boundary crossing and transformation. And I'm going to sort of move into that and help you see that here. This is too big on the screen, so we'll shrink it down. I think that's pretty good. There are three moments in the gospel that I want to call attention to as we begin to move into it. His baptism. Oh yeah, the green thing, huh? How does that work? Ooh, look at that. Okay, baptism, transfiguration. There you can see again this portal, this sense of that you're moving in and out, you're crossing a boundary, you're moving between worlds. This is at the beginning of Mark. This is smack dab in the middle of Mark. And the cross, I picked one very stylistic. You can see it just swarming with angels. I think the notion, I didn't read up on this piece of art, but I'm going to guess that the notion here is Jacob's ladder, that the cross has sort of become a Jacob's ladder where the worlds, where the angels are ascending and descending up and down the rungs of the ladder. But my point in showing it to you is it's a boundary crossing. It's a place where the worlds meet, where the upper world sort of, where the boundary between the worlds becomes loose, and they start to go like this. And these three moments in Mark's gospel constitute its structure, beginning, middle, end, as you move through. And we're going to look at it in those terms, or according to that structure. Another picture. This is one thing on Prezi I don't quite have, is the size of the thing, but we can always fix it. There we go. Okay, here I just sort of laid it out on a grid, and I put it in a circle so you could kind of see it as a round. You know, the journey from dawn and morning in Galilee. By the way, there's another big division in the gospel. We have three moments. We have dawn in Galilee, the baptism. We have transfiguration at midday. Then we have the movement into Jerusalem, into evening and night. And then, of course, death and resurrection and the renewal and the birth of the church, right? And so it's very easy to fit this story into this sort of grid and structure. I think what I'm going to do is pause for just a minute. I have about 15 more minutes to talk at you, but I want to open it for questions to see how you're hanging with what I'm giving you. Any questions so far?
I always have a question, but I want to leave a little bit of space. Okay, how, you know, if Jung understood this sort of, this way in which this works by looking at sort of the ancient way in which people understood their reality, right? How cognizant do you think the gospel writer is in constructing it this way? Is the gospel writer constructing it this way because that's the milieu out from which they understand the world in general, given their where they were, or are they? I mean, are they doing it intentionally, or does it just happen that way because that's the way in which the world is understood in that particular historical context?
I'd say both. I'd say both.
So there was some intentionality.
Even when he's not aware, this is like, you know, how do you tie your shoe? I mean,
Right.
it's just
You
sort
just
of,
think like this.
it's just part of the way they structure their whole reality.
Right.
Now, I do want to make one important point, because I know this probably can be upsetting when you start to, you know, put a biblical story into a larger cultural context that's not strictly biblical. The notion of mimesis, of imitation, would have been that let's say a writer or a poet or a teacher or somebody, maybe even a prophet, would have written a story following the general structure of the Odyssey. But they were not saying that, in this case, Jesus is copying Odysseus. It's not so much how he's like him that's important. It's how he's not like him that's important. Jesus is like Odysseus, but he's greater. And I think that's what Mark is saying. That's what Mark is saying to the Greek world.
Yeah.
He's saying, your hero, your archetype, our guy is just like that, but he's better. Because, you know, for example, when he comes home incognito, just like Odysseus did, you know, Odysseus was a great king, but his house was overrun with suitors, and he had to come home incognito, dressed as a servant, you recall. But when he came in, and he slaughtered the suitors, right? Well, Jesus comes incognito too, to his home that is also overrun by his enemies. He doesn't slaughter them. He sacrifices himself on the cross. And so he flips Odysseus right on its ear, but he's still following the pattern. So what Mark is saying is, your guy's great, our guy's great. And time after time after time, that's what happens. I mean, I don't have time to go into the incidents, but think of all the experiences on the boat that the disciples had with Jesus, and that Odysseus' crew had with Odysseus, and where they wound up. Odysseus' crew was pretty much wiped out, I would say, as the story goes on. But, you know, Jesus deals more patiently with his own disciples, who are a lot like Odysseus' crew in their obstinance, and they don't get it, you know, and he, you know, the whole thing. So he's like Odysseus, he's better. Okay, so.
Randy?
Yes.
You have a question?
Yes.
I'm coming to the conclusion that when you set this against the framework that the biblical stuff against, it really enhances, it explains why this story has such enduring, how it has endured.
Yes.
It's because it is touching the deepest levels of our experience and our history as a people.
Absolutely.
And that's why it's.
You just paraphrased my opening page.
He did that last week, didn't he? Didn't Paul nail it last week?
I don't know, but then you're exactly right. See, that's what I'm saying, is that it hits us it doesn't hit us at an intellectual level, it hits us deeper, almost at the level of the body, of these fundamental ordering principles that are part of just what we are. And that story not only reflects them, but in a sense shapes them and gives them content in a way that we don't have otherwise. That's what, you know, that's what our religious stories should be. And that's what a good one does. That's why I think Mark is one of the great religious geniuses of all time. And his story is one of the greatest. And I've done comparative religion. I'm not saying that, you know, there's a lot I haven't done, but I've done quite a bit. And I've read in Eastern religions, and I have a great amount of respect for all of it. But Mark, to me, is like at the top of the heap, because if you just look at it as an artifact, and that's what I do. I do in religious studies, we don't come to it with theological assumptions. We bracket those, set those aside. I may have theological beliefs, but I can't impose those on the text. So I look at Mark as an artifact, as a religious work that was created by a person. And I say, as a religious artifact created by a person, it has a level of genius, complexity.
To find this, I mean, that whole idea of reading ourselves into the biblical stories is the way by which you access this all. I mean, it can't be found simply intellectually looking out for something. You've got to submerge yourself in these stories.
Right, and I think well, see, I got to be careful how I say this. I think we've impoverished ourselves by not getting the full story, by not really looking at it. It's as though, I could say this as a person who's been in the church for 40 years. It's as though we're afraid of something. What are we afraid of? I mean, the Greek world, we call it pagan, because we want to separate the Christian world from the pagan world, because somehow this is bad and we're good. But, you know, the pagan world has a long history, and there's a deep spirituality and religion there of various kinds. I'm not saying it was all great, just like anything else, it's a mixed bag. But there is such a rich amount of history there, and you know, culture and imagery and archetypes, that to only explore the biblical predecessors to the gospel is, in a sense, to impoverish it. It is to make it a two-dimensional story that is really a three-dimensional story. And I think sometimes we miss how it hits us at these fundamental levels. Now, I only have about 10 more minutes, so I'm going to go on with this. Now, you know, we haven't done any what I would call exposition. I think this is my last piece here. And I'm going to just do a few minutes of that, and then we're going to talk about some Bible stories. This is Sunday school now. And you think about the baptism with me. I'm not going to read through it. But I suggest that the baptism is the dawn. As a matter of fact, I suggest it's a solar scene. It's the rising of the sun, if you will, and I think there are biblical verses that show that. Although it's very implicit, it's not direct. So it's not only the sun's rising, it's dawn, it's spring. It's also a breakthrough of the higher world into this world. And you can see it with the dove. There's language in the Gospel of Mark that I want to draw your attention to. It's in the baptismal scene, you can read it, where it says, he saw the heavens torn open. And that word torn is a violent word, ripped apart. And it really harkens back to the book of Isaiah, where he says, oh, that you would rend the heavens and come down. There's this violent rupture of the worlds going on there. And we just read a nice, cute little baptismal scene. But this is a boundary crossing moment where the worlds that are normally separate suddenly become merged. Not merged, but what's the word when something passes through a membrane, you know?
Reached or?
Like an osmosis. They become permeable. That was the word I was looking for. To one another. So heaven is torn, the dove descends, the voice says, you are my son, my beloved. Now those things, not the dove, but the heaven being torn, and the voice saying, you are my son, if you track those, they are present in all three of our moments that I put up earlier. The baptism, the transfiguration, and the crucifixion. You'll recall the veil being torn, and you'll recall at the transfiguration where he speaks to Peter and John. He says, this is my son, listen to him. It's interesting that oftentimes where Mark is implicit, Luke and Matthew are explicit. At the very beginning of Jesus' ministry, following his baptism, Matthew has a quote that says, you know, those who sat in darkness, upon them a great light has dawned. And so he's very clear that this is sort of a mourning moment in the story at the beginning. There is also, yes, ma'am?
I just have an observation to make about the dove.
Yes.
And many of us know the dove as a symbol of peace, but it's also, in centuries of art, a symbol of the spirit, of the soul. And so in ancient art in particular, you'll see an image of a person dying, a holy person, that's often Christ, and the dove is leaving the body and ascending to heaven.
So that's a symbol of ascent as well as descent.
Yes.
And this is important. I'm glad you brought it up because and again, here's a whole section in the book that I don't have time to develop. In Jesus' day, there was, and much further on in the medieval time, excuse me, I'll come over here and get back in the camera.
Thank you, yeah. Make me work.
In Jesus' day, there was a practice called Merkaba mysticism. Merkaba, the throne. The Merkaba is the throne of Yahweh. And it was modeled on Ezekiel, Daniel, parts of Isaiah, and also the character of Enoch. Enoch is huge. I mean, we don't even, study Enoch, but we should, because there's a whole literature and a whole movement based on Enoch. But this Merkaba mysticism of that day was ascent mysticism. It was basically having a mystical experience of the throne of Yahweh. And I'm going to suggest that might be, I can't prove it, because it's one of those things very difficult to dig up, and the books that scholars write on this, that cost $150 to buy, and that kind of stuff, it's only a few people. It's like a secret. I don't know what that is, why these secrets are held. But this was a practice back in the first century, at the time of Jesus. Can I say Jesus was a Merkaba mystic? I can't say that. But the inference there is very strong, because this is not just the voice coming down, this is an ascent. Jesus has penetrated the veil. But can we say it that way? And I think that's a very biblical way of saying it. He has ascended into the throne of God. And that makes him something. That makes him, in our terminology, a mystic. But in biblical terminology, it makes him a priest. And that Jesus, in this baptismal scene and beyond, there's the leper scene coming up, I have a feeling we won't get to, and there's Peter's house. But I believe that they're in your reading. So you'll get a sense from them in your reading if I don't cover them this morning. These are, to my eye and reading, these are priestly passages. They show Jesus to be, if I can put it down and dirty, the legitimate high priest of Israel. Can I say it that way? He's the high priest. Not the guy, not Caiaphas, not the guy in Jerusalem. Jesus. And he is legitimated or legitimized not by priestly inheritance and protocol, but by God himself. Thou art my son, my beloved. You're the one. He's chosen. What has he chosen to do and be? He is the one who's chosen to break the boundary between the worlds, to bring heaven to earth, to bring earth to heaven, to bring the people to God and God to the people. He's the high priest. That's what the high priest does. And I think if you read the passage on the leper, it's pretty clear. But when you go to Peter's house, it's really clear. The leper scene, very quickly, is, you may recall, the leper comes up to him. This is very early in Mark chapter 1. You know, cleanse me, you can make me whole. Okay, he heals him. He doesn't just cleanse him. Now that was a priest's job, and he was usurping the priest's role. Well, the priest didn't heal. They did a ritual, cleansing. Priests were all about who's in, who's out. Ooh, you got leprosy, you're out. You're over here, you got to go through the prescribed thing. You can't come back in until you go through all that. So Jesus one-ups the priest. Remember I talked about one-upping Odysseus? Well, we're also one-upping Jerusalem. He one-ups the priest. He heals the guy. Go back to the priest. Show him as, and the wording in, I believe it's 144. Mark 144. Go back, show yourself to the priest, and your translations are going to wimp out here. As a proof to them. No. As a testimony against them. That's a stronger way to say it. And my reading and, you know, poking around, I'm no expert on the Greek, but that's, I think, if you look into it, you'll see that that's a legitimate translation. He is saying, go and show them as a testimony against them. Why? Because they're weak, and they don't, they say they're priests, but they don't bring the worlds together like he does. He is the real deal. He does it in action. In substance, they do it in ritual and in ceremony. Then we move to Peter's house, and I got 3 minutes to talk about this, then we're going to be done. In Peter's house, it's a wonderful scene. It's one of my favorite in the Gospels. He comes to Peter's house, you may recall, people gather around, so many that nobody can get in or out. Bing, the light should go on when that's said, because that is pointing us back to the Old Testament, when the Shekinah glory of God came down into the tabernacle and nobody could get, the priests couldn't get in, you know? A little clue there. Peter's house has become a sort of stand-in temple. And Jesus now, the high priest, is at the center. The people are all gathered around. And there is this communion in the temple that is sort of meant to show that this is the new way, if you will. They're one-upping, you know, what's going on down there. And you know the story of the guys who come, the 4 guys, right, who bring the, there's a 4 by the way, who bring the paralytic and they set him down in front. And the whole story that transpires there was so powerful. Of course, he heals him, and then he gets into this little confrontation with the scribes. Oh, how dare you? Nobody can heal but God. In order that you may know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins, I say, oh, sorry, he pronounces his sins forgiven first. That's what he does. And then he heals them to show that this is not just some ritual thing. This is happening in power because the world's now, the boundary between the world has been opened. And he says, rise, get up and walk. Matter of fact, it's very interesting, you know, and I'm associating all of this with intuition. Jesus had a vision of God's forgiveness and of union with God within the veil. Can I say it as simply as that? And that intuition that he had of higher meaning and connection informed everything he did, including his healing, his exorcism, his teaching. I'm going to show that next week. This was all vision-based, and it's all a simple idea. God's embrace, unconditional, of the people. It wasn't that Jesus was better, that he was superior. It was that he was the representative, the Son of Man of all the people. And that unconditional acceptance and embrace was so powerful and transformative, it threatened the entire system. And that's what he was bringing. And he showed it by raising up the paralytic. He looks at the scribes who are squabbling, and in his intuitive way. By the way, intuition is the most clairvoyant of all the functions. When you're intuitive, you get an instant hit on things. You can see around corners. You kind of almost maybe know what people are thinking. And he looks at him and he says, "Why are you grumbling among yourselves?" Then he says, "In order that you may know, take up your bed, rise and walk." And so that sets the scene now for the whole rest of the story. It's one of challenge. It's one of, in a sense, subversion, and of healing and of forgiveness being expressed, taught. And he's going to, of course, not be satisfied with this powerful ministry of teaching and healing that he has in Galilee. He's going to go to Jerusalem. And sometimes when I read Mark, I think, why? Couldn't he just have stayed back there? Because he had so much success. And remember what Jung says, it's my final thought. We have a dominant function, maybe two. Those are our adapted functions. We do so well with those because we're comfortable with them. We know how to function in them. But when we move to inferior function, that's when things get to be messy. So Jesus, if I can say it psychologically, is in dominant function right now. He's in his intuition. He's in his visionary mode. Nobody can touch him. He's in his power. Next week, wisdom. Thank you.
Wow. You want to tackle a couple of questions?
Any questions?
If you gotta go, you gotta go. It's 10:32. Service starts at 10:45. But if you want to hang around and ask a couple questions, we'll get them on videotape so we can all see them.
Yes, sir.
Were you able to get the...
You were referring
Yeah, I got it.
earlier to Odysseus
It's
as
up front.
Greco-Roman world.
Yeah.
Are there other books to understand the kind of background of that world or culture?
Yeah, I think one of the best ones I have over here is Bruce Molina. And I would suggest probably any of his books. But Bruce's book on book on the book of Revelation is amazing, and it has a lot to do with Mark, because there's a real connection between the book of Revelation, its symbols, and the book of Mark. Yes?
I think the quaternity archetype is much broader in the world, because when I was going to Guatemala, I looked at the Guatemalan religion, and they use a quaternity, they use a cross symbol. There's, it's archetypal.
We are going to
Not
spend
just
one whole session on the archetypal cross. If I get there, if I have enough time, it'll be our last session. I agree with you. And there's a Mayan cross, and I've written on that. It's a wonderful thing to look at. Thanks for bringing that up. Hopefully we'll get to it. Anything else?
I have a question.
Yeah.
In today's service, it talked about Jesus was foreshadowing his resurrection. He says about the temple, he says, tear it down and rebuild it. What part of is that an archetype? What part of that? That's that transformation? Is that?
I think part of what Mark is saying there is simple. The physical structure is passing away, but there is a spiritual temple, and that is, of course, the body of Christ. So once again, this mystical visionary experience supersedes the ritual and the formal temple and that whole apparatus. And that's not just Jesus. I mean, that's Christianity. That's what Christianity is built on. That the whole sense that we are the mystical body of Christ. We are the temple.
We're the temple.
We are the temple. Yeah, spiritual temple. Okay. Anybody else? All right. Thank you.
Oh, sorry.